80,000 people walked into that stadium for one reason, and it had nothing to do with the man who actually broke the night wide open. Everyone came to watch Usain Bolt. Nobody came for the race that ended up making history. And by the time it was over, a record had been set that, even after more than a decade, no human being on this entire planet has been able to touch. Stick around, because the way this race unfolded is almost unbelievable, and there is a number coming up near the end of this video that might be the most insane statistic in the history of middle-distance running. If stories like this get your heart racing, smash that subscribe button right now, because we are about to walk through one of the greatest individual performances ever produced on a track, and trust me, you do not want to leave before the final twist. Let's go back to the 9th of August, 2012, inside the London Olympic Stadium. The entire week had been dominated by one storyline, the showdown between Usain Bolt and Yohan Blake in the 200 meters. If a world record was going to fall that night, almost every single person in that crowd assumed it would come from those few seconds of pure straight-line sprinting. Almost nobody had circled the 800 meters on their schedule. It is a race fans respect but rarely fall in love with because it sits in this brutal middle ground. It is too long to feel like a clean sprint and far too fast to ever feel comfortable. Your legs flood with acid. Your lungs start burning long before the finish line is even in sight. The man about to flip that entire night upside down was David Rudisha. He grew up in Kenya as part of the Maasai, the proud warrior community known across the world for herding cattle across open grassland. Running was not something he picked up. It was something woven into who he was from birth. His father, Daniel Rudisha, had actually won an Olympic silver medal for Kenya all the way back at the 1968 Games in Mexico City. As a young boy, David held that very medal in his hands inside his family home, and something shifted inside him in that moment. He decided right then that he was not just going to follow in his father's footsteps. He was going to go further than him. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall, David had this long, smooth, gliding stride, almost like a sprinter's body had been mistakenly handed to a distance runner, and he was about to use every inch of that stride to do something no human being had ever managed before. Here is something that puts what happened next into real perspective. For decades, the 800-meter world record had been one of the most stubborn marks in the entire sport. Sebastian Coe, the British legend who actually helped organize these very London Games, set a world record in this event back in 1981. In the 40-plus years that followed, the record only came down by less than a single second. Let that number sit with you for a moment, because it tells you exactly how guarded, how tight, and how nearly impossible this distance really is to push forward. Rudisha had already broken the world record twice during 2010, eventually lowering it to 1 minute 41.01 seconds. But there was one number that no human had ever cleared, a wall that the sport had quietly accepted might be permanently sealed. 1 minute and 41 seconds flat. Going under that mark would be like cracking a barrier everyone secretly believed could never be cracked. And that is exactly where the story is heading. So stay with me. What made this final in London so unforgettable was how Rudisha chose to run it. In most world record attempts, a pacemaker leads a field through the early laps, cutting through the air, doing the hardest work, so the star athlete can save energy for the finish. Rudisha had none of that. No pacemaker, nobody to hide behind, and nobody out front for him to chase down. From the moment the gun fired, he charged straight to the front of the entire field and simply began running away from the best 800-meter runners alive on the planet at that time. He flew through the first lap in 49.28 seconds. For a 2-lap race, that kind of opening looked almost reckless. Coaches sitting in that stadium must have assumed he had gone out far too hard and would pay a brutal price somewhere in that final stretch. He never paid for it. Rudisha kept his form tall, his rhythm smooth, while the entire crowd rose to its feet, the roar rolling around that stadium like a wave of thunder building towards something nobody could quite predict yet. Down the home straight, he did not tie up. He did not fade the way almost every single runner does at the end of this brutal event. He powered cleanly through the finish line, fist raised into the air, and the giant scoreboard froze on a number that would echo through this sport for years to come. 1 minute 40.91 seconds. In that single instant, he became the first man in human history to run 2 full laps of a track in under 1 minute and 41 seconds. He had carved a full tenth of a second off his own previous world record, and he had done it leading from the gun all the way to the tape, completely alone at the front, on the single biggest stage that this sport has ever offered. Sebastian Coe himself, a former world record holder over this exact same distance, called what he had just witnessed the most extraordinary piece of running he had ever seen in his entire life. And here's the detail that makes this even harder to wrap your head around. Rudisha covered every 200-meter section of that race at pure sprint speed, yet he had to hold on to that violence across the full 800 meters. There was no moment to relax, no stretch where his body got to recover. Every single step demanded power, balance, and total control. One mistake in rhythm, and the record disappears. One moment of panic, and the entire final straight collapses. But Rudisha looked completely calm out there. His shoulders stayed loose, his head stayed still, and his stride kept opening up even as the pain behind his eyes was clearly getting worse with every step. That calm did not mean the race felt easy. It came from years of training his body to stay smooth while everything inside it was quietly falling apart. If you think the story ends there, it does not, because what happened behind Rudisha that same night is honestly just as wild, and it is coming up right after this. The final 200 meters of an 800-meter race can feel longer than the first 600 combined. Vision narrows. Arms turn heavy. The track itself almost seems to fight against every single step you take. And yet Rudisha kept attacking through all of it. By that point, he was not racing the other men in that field anymore. He was racing the red numbers waiting for him at the finish line, chasing a barrier that had outlived every single great runner who came before him. With 80,000 people roaring around that stadium, he reached it first. Now here comes the part that truly proves how fast Rudisha was actually moving that night, because he did not just win a race alone. He reached back and dragged an entire field into history right alongside him. Crossing the line just behind him was an 18-year-old from Botswana named Nigel Amos, who finished in 1 minute 41.73 seconds. That single run set a world junior record. It would have been fast enough to win almost any other 800-meter final ever staged anywhere on Earth. Amos was so completely emptied by the effort that he actually had to be carried off the track on a stretcher afterward. And behind those two runners, every single one of the 8 finalists that night ran a personal best, a season best, or a national record. No 800-meter final in the history of the sport had ever been that deep and that fast from top to bottom in a single race. That is exactly what happens when one man drags an entire event up to a level it had never reached before. Then came the long silence that followed. After his masterpiece in London, Rudisha went on to defend his Olympic gold medal in Rio back in 2016, proving once and for all that his first crown had been no accident. Injuries slowly wore his body down over the following years, and he eventually retired before the Tokyo Games, walking away without ever surrendering his throne over 2 laps of the track. And the record itself simply refused to fall. Season after season, brilliant new stars arrived on the scene. The shoes got lighter and faster. The training science got sharper. The technology kept improving every single year. And still, not one single person on the entire planet could touch 1 minute and 40.91 seconds. The closest anyone has managed to come is a young Kenyan named Emmanuel Wanyonyi, who clocked 1 minute 41.11 seconds back in 2024. He finished 0.2 of a second short in a race decided by hundredths. 0.2 of a second might as well be an entire mile. 14 years later, Rudisha's number still sits right at the very top of that list, completely untouched by anyone who has tried to reach it. So when people argue about who the fastest athlete this world has ever produced actually is, the names that get thrown around are almost always pure sprinters. But raw speed is not only measured in 10 flat seconds in a straight line, over 2 full laps of track, in the exact place where your body is screaming at you to slow down, and your mind is begging you to just stop. No human being who has ever lived has moved faster than David Rudisha did on that single August night in London. That is the 800-meter bomb the entire world is still talking about today. A record so far ahead of its time that we may not see anyone break it for years, maybe even decades to come. If this story gave you chills, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because the next impossible record we are about to break down is just as unforgettable as this one, and you genuinely will not want to miss it.